Welcome, wherever you are tuning in. Thank you so much for being with us tonight for our event, community briefing, Title IX, and what we can do. My name is Alex Del Rosario. My pronouns are they, he, and I am the national organizer with the National Center for Transgender Equality. Before we begin tonight's conversation, I am going to kick things off with a land recognition. As we gather in this virtual space, we must acknowledge that the ground beneath our feet is historically the home of Indigenous peoples, many of whom who have been forced to leave for other lands. Native nations negotiated government to government, preserving their sovereign land, rights, and privileges through treaties. When land was not ceded through treaties, it was stolen from our Indigenous relatives. This acknowledgement recognizes the first caretakers of this land, the suffering they have endured, and the sacrifices made by Native people. I am currently an uninvited guest on the land of the Arapaho, Ute, and Cheyenne peoples. May we remember that Indigenous peoples are not a people of the past, but are here with us now, still continuing to demonstrate their talents and gifts amidst an ongoing backdrop of colonialism and oppression. If there are any Indigenous folks who are attending this event virtually, I invite you to share your tribe or nation in the chat so that we may recognize that you are here. I hope this land acknowledgement statement will inspire folks who are tuning in to stand in solidarity with Native nations. What does solidarity look like? Solidarity looks like donating time and money to Indigenous-led organizations and communities. I encourage folks to take the time, if you haven't done so already, to Google or research what Indigenous-led organizations are in your community. Amplifying the voices of Indigenous people leading grassroots change movements, intentionally learning about the rich history of the Indigenous peoples that inhabited and cared for the land you currently stand on. Include space for meaningful land acknowledgements in your events and presentations, and of course, returning land to its original stewards. With that being said, we'll go ahead and jump in. Thank you again for coming together tonight to connect and chat about the draft Title IX athletics rule that the Department of Education is currently gathering public comment on. We have several wonderful folks on this panel who will be talking a little about Title IX and what it means and what we can do to make a difference. And so to start, I would love for each panelist to take a minute or two to say hello, to share a little bit about who you are and the organization that you work with for folks who may be tuning in and might be unfamiliar with your organization. So to kick things off, we'll just go in alphabetical order. And I believe, Erica, I will pass it off to you.
Thanks so much, Alex. Hello, all. I am Erica Lorschbaugh. I'm the Executive Director of Interact Advocates for Intersex Youth. And we are the nation's oldest and largest, and some might say only, organization dedicated to legal advocacy on behalf of young people with variations in their sex characteristics, also known as intersex people. I come to this work as an intersex person myself. I am also a queer person and a genderqueer person. I'm here in my home on the land of the Lenape people in Brooklyn, New York. And I definitely was not an expert in Title IX or Title IX athletics for most of my law and policy career. But suddenly, as folks are looking to define sex in narrow ways so as to keep trans kids out of sport, they are also doing that in a way that impacts kids with intersex variations as well. So I'm happy to speak with folks in the community tonight, and hopefully we can, answer all your questions and help folks understand the power that we have to make good change.
Awesome. Thank you, Erica. And I will pass it off to Melanie.
Amazing. Whenever we go in alphabetical order, I'm like not usually the not last person. So shout out to this alphabet. Hi everybody. My name is Melanie Willingham Jaggers. I use they and she pronouns. I am the executive director at GLSEN. Sorry to go back to land acknowledgement. I am currently in Harlem, USA, which is the ancestral lands of the Lenape and the Wappinger people. So let's see a little bit about me and our organization. So at GLSEN, we've been around since 1990. The thing that we have done since then is work to make schools safe, affirming, and supportive for LGBTQ plus young people. We have moved and are continuing to move in a way that understands that racial justice, gender justice, and disability justice outcomes are critical outcomes for our education system. If our education system is going to do what it needs to do. And what it needs to do is prepare the next generation to participate in, to lead, and to build a multiracial democracy for all of us that includes all of us and that excludes no one. So that's a little bit about who we are. Me and my dog and my partner, like I said, live uptown in New York City.
Awesome. Quick question. What kind of dog do you have, Melanie?
Great question. She is a Jack Russell Terrier whose name is Mojito.
Awesome, cute. And our last panelist is NCTE's very own Olivia.
Thanks, Alex. My name is Olivia Hunt, she and her pronouns. I am stumbling over words, and we're about 5 minutes into this presentation. This is going to be a really fun panel. She and her pronouns. I'm policy director at National Center for Transgender Equality, which for the past 20 years has been advocating for transgender people and non-binary people's rights, both nationally in Washington, D.C. and in state and local governments across the country. We are active in every space that trans people are found to be found in, and trans people are to be found in every community across this country, so we are active everywhere we can be. As far as I know, and unfortunately I've not been able to confirm this, the place where I live is ancestral Dogue land, but nobody's been able to confirm that with any reliable resources, so please don't quote me on that outside of this context.
Awesome. Thanks, Olivia. So for folks who are tuning in, these are our amazing panelists. I encourage you to follow their work, sign up for their email lists, all that good stuff. That's Melanie with GLSEN, Erica with Interact, and Olivia with National Center for Transgender Equality. So thank you folks for introducing yourselves. We'll go ahead and jump in now. Just something to expect for the community who's tuning in. The panel will be about an hour long, more or less, and there will be time for questions. And so as we have the conversation the next hour or so, feel free to drop your questions, whether that's YouTube or Facebook, and hopefully we will have time to answer any questions you might have. Awesome. So we're here to brief you all in the community on the draft Title IX athletics rule that has been proposed, I want to say, maybe 3 weeks ago at this point. For context, the Department of Education is currently gathering public comment on this draft Title IX athletics rule that will impact trans and intersex youth's right to play sports with their friends. The current proposed rule affirms that Title IX secures the right of trans, non-binary, and intersex students to play sports free from discrimination. This is the first time that the Title IX rule would address trans students' eligibility to participate on sex-separated athletic teams. However, the rule can be stronger, and we as a community have the opportunity to advocate for a final rule that is more inclusive and stronger. And so we have a chance to make that happen and to give y'all the tools that you need to submit a public comment. We want to make sure that you understand what Title IX is, what this proposed rule means, and why it's so important for our community. And so we'll go ahead and jump into the questions. My first question is open to all three panelists. Olivia, you can answer first. Let's talk about Title IX. What is Title IX? There are probably some folks who might have maybe a sense of what Title IX is, but it's very complex. There's a lot of content there. What is Title IX, and what would the proposed Title IX athletics rule do?
So Title IX is the term we usually use, the name we usually use to describe the federal civil rights law that prohibits discrimination on the basis of sex in education. That covers a wide range. We're talking kindergarten through 12th grades, the entire grade school range, plus colleges and universities. It's primarily tied to federal funding. So if you've got any school or university that has any funding to the federal government, it is going to be governed by Title IX. Certain private schools are not. The interactions there get very, very complicated, but for the most part, we are looking at, with Title IX, the civil rights rule that impacts discrimination on the basis of sex in education. One thing that we know under federal civil rights law is that on the basis of sex includes LGBTQ status, being lesbian, gay, bi, pan, asexual, or being non-binary, trans, or also intersex. This is made clear in the Supreme Court's ruling in Boston v. Clayton County in 2020, which made it clear that by necessity, discrimination against people on the basis of their gender, their sexual orientation, gender identity, gender presentation, sex characteristics are all going to be something that is going to be inherently discrimination on the basis of sex. Now, I can keep talking for a bit, or I can hand off to explain what the rules are and what they mean to somebody else. Either way, if I got a show of hands here. You want me to keep going, Erica? Melanie? Okay. All right, so that's just the basic rule. What makes things a little bit more complicated when we talk about this process and how federal laws work, the different departments have the ability to create regulations, we call them rules or regulations, that explain how they're going to interpret, specifically how they're going to apply the federal laws going forward. So what we're looking at right now is the Department of Education has put out a draft regulation of how they want to apply Title IX in light of this understanding we now have that's again been made clear by the Supreme Court, that LGBTQ people are covered under LGBTQIA people are covered under Title IX. And so last summer we had an initial rulemaking that covered a lot of the general aspects of non-discrimination education that included LGBTQIA plus people. And this year we are doing a targeted rulemaking specifically on a rule about sports inclusion. So again, notice and comment rulemaking. Melanie, Erica, anyone going to save me here, or do I keep going? All right. So the way this process works is that when the administration, when the federal government puts out one of these rules they want to enforce, we, the public, have the opportunity to comment on it and say what we think about that rule. Do we think that rule should be stronger in this case? Do we think the rule should be weaker? And that's actually true for all federal rulemaking. You can go and there's an opportunity to provide comments on all of that. But right now, we specifically care about the Title IX rulemaking, which is specifically focused on inclusion for trans, non-binary, and intersex kids, trans, non-binary, and intersex students in sports. The rule that again, nobody's going to save me. I'm just going to have you keep going here. Okay. The rule is really important to move forward because right now the existing regulations, even though we have a policy, we have some laws that are kind of floating out there, the existing regulations that people can invoke to enforce their rights just don't say anything about how how trans, non-binary, and intersex people are considered under sports, which means we've got kind of a patchwork framework of everyone just figuring it out as they go along and making up rules that they think will work best. Rulemaking like this gives us an opportunity to kind of create uniformity. We create a system that says, hey, discrimination against trans students on the basis of their transness are illegal under Title IX. And that's really core to what this rule does. For the first time, we are actually having a rule saying that Title IX prohibits what we call categorical bans against trans people participating in sports. And that is a massive improvement over what we currently have, because what we currently have is, in effect, nothing in the regulations. And so this is going to make a big difference for how trans people, how trans students, intersex students, non-binary students are viewed under that aspect of federal law. So I can keep going, and if from the expressions, I don't know if all three of you are going to expect me to keep going here, or I can hand off to somebody else. Alex, Erica, please.
I can jump in. So thank you for that overview. You never want to stop somebody who's given a great overview of a thing. So thank you for that super great overview. Here's what I would offer, which is that, you know, when we think about Title IX, right, the lay person, most people think about Title IX as related to access to, and funding for sports programs. We often think about it as related to protection against sexual harassment and sexual assault. We also think about it as around support for pregnant and parenting folks in school settings, right? That's what we generally think about in Title IX. And so, you know, Title IX is an important civil right protection for queer, trans, non-binary, intersex people, because as we know, discrimination against those folks, queer, trans, non-binary, intersex folks, is discrimination based on gender, right? It is gender discrimination, right? It's about assumptions and presumptions, prejudices, and assertions about someone's gender used to discriminate. So just to add on, right, to what was already said, the proposed rule makes clear that categorical bans against trans, non-binary, and intersex people, like those enacted already in 21 states, violate Title IX. The proposed rule does not require schools to impose any restrictions on participation consistent with gender identity, and is the only approach, and that's the only approach to separate gender school sports that does not risk violating Title IX. So there are 14 states plus DC, the District of Columbia, that have trans-inclusive athletic participation policies in place. That's a lot of P's. And those 14 states and DC, those trans-inclusive participation policies are in full compliance with the rule as is currently proposed. So if a school does propose restrictions on participation of our folks, trans, non-binary, intersex students, consistent with their gender identity, they have to do two things. They have to justify why the restriction is necessary to fulfill an important educational objective. And two, they have to guarantee to minimize harm to trans, non-binary, intersex students who will face additional barriers to playing sports that could potentially be would be excluded. They will have to do this for every sport at every level of competition within that sport and each grade or educational level where the restriction is imposed. And the proposed rule makes clear that types of justification that have dominated the conversation so far are unacceptable, right? You can't say that, oh, we're discriminating because that's what Olympic or NCAA soccer does, so we're gonna do it for middle and high school soccer. You can't do that. You cannot say that trans girls have a categorical advantage over cis girls in sports. You can't say that. Transphobia and junk science are not acceptable justifications. And let me say that again for those in the back. Transphobia and junk science are not acceptable justifications. So taken together, the proposed rule tells us that restrictions that limit or exclude trans, non-binary, intersex folks from participating in sports K-8 and in most high school sports should be found to be in violation of Title IX. However, and I want to be as clear about this as possible, the rule that we want to see, that GLSEN believes is the right rule, is a rule that prohibits any restriction on trans, non-binary, intersex students participating in school sports consistent with their gender identity at all levels in K through 12, right? So this is a great start. This is covering a lot of ground that had not been covered before in previous Title IX rules. And we've got more to do. And we've got more to do in order to get this completely right, not just, getting it 70% right or getting it 80% right. Is a good start. It's not the whole thing, and we have to be clear that when anyone is left out, when exclusion is justified for anyone, it's actually not. We're not accomplishing what we must for all students.
Awesome, thank you, Melanie. Erica, do you have anything to add?
Yeah. Yeah, a few folks have asked me, how the rule applies to young people with intersex variations, or if it applies differently, and especially as more folks have come um, to actually read the text of the rule. The rule doesn't use the word intersex or talk about variations in sex characteristics. The rule just says that, basically that there's a presumption in favor of the notion that, um, kids and young adults in college should be able to play school sports in on the teams that best align with their gender identity. And so the way this applies to intersex kids, if you're a young person with intersex variations, and your gender identity, seems to align with your physical presentation, very likely you're not going to be in a situation right now in school athletics where people are like, asking intrusive questions and asking if you really should be on that team. But for a lot of young people with intersex variations, they may not uh, um, identify with the sex that they were assigned at birth, and their gender identity may also be different from their physical presentation, because intersex variations basically just mean that someone's body doesn't necessarily align with kind of traditional or stereotypical assumptions about what a male or female body might look like. And also I just want to name that Title IX has been really clearly interpreted by the Department of Justice overall, to be clear that discrimination on the basis of someone's variations in their sex characteristics would be prohibited sex discrimination. And the Department of Education has also made clear that this rule, as written, is intended to protect kids with variations in their sex characteristics as well, even if it's not so much a matter of their gender identity being different, but a lot of the time too, for non-binary kids with intersex traits, there can be questions and intrusive inquiries about where they belong. The rule also makes really clear, or the Department of Education has made really clear in its guidance, and we would like to see this more clear in the rule at Interact, that things like sex testing and hormone testing are generally not going to be considered appropriate ways of determining if a young person is eligible to play on a girls' or women's team.
Thank you. Thank you, Erica, Melanie, and Olivia, for y'all's very in-depth answers to our first question. The second question is going to be for Erica and Melanie, and you both already talked about this a little bit, and feel free to add any more if there is more there. But how would a rule like this impact trans and intersex youth, and why is it important that trans and intersex youth have access to sports? And Erica, I will let you take the lead on this.
Okay, great. Thank you so much. Well, so I just want to say that I guess I'll answer your second question first, if that's not too annoying. I was involved in school sports as a kid. And I probably wasn't a total jock. Like, I was like a hybrid nerd and jock. And I probably leaned to the nerd side. However, there were some sports I was really good at. I loved volleyball. I grew up in the West, so that's like a normal sport to play in school. And there were other sports I was not so good at, and that's a-okay. I just want to say that, especially for kids who might lean like to the nerdy side, or I also was a kid who was a little Aspergian and like had a hard time making friends. I was ahead in school. Sometimes I wasn't the most popular kid. But participating in sports and participating in sports teams, it did a lot for me in my development. It helped me break out of my shell. Other things did too, like choir and theater that were maybe a little more nerdy, but that's the point, is that different people vibe in different places. And this is not even just conjecture. There's a ton of science that suggests that just kids being able to participate in sports with their peers is good for all kids. And I think it's kind of proven to be especially good for kids who might feel a little different or feel like an other. Like when you're getting those high fives at the end of the game or whatever, that's like it's like a moment for everybody to tap into that collective moment. And so like the idea of just denying any kids that because they have any real or perceived differences from their classmates feels so cruel. It blows my mind. And I actually forget your first question, Alex, because I'm in my feelings now.
Oh, no. The first question, which, like I mentioned, I think you had already touched on, how would a rule like this impact trans and intersex youth? So
Yeah,
if there was
sure.
anything to add there, feel free to, and it's totally okay if not.
Oh, okay, yeah. I think I hit on the kind of main practical things, which are like things like chromosome testing to see if a girl is really an XX girl, or hormonal testing to see if a kid's testosterone levels are in the range of what's appropriate for girls. Stuff like that is not going to be justifiable under this rule, which is a really huge deal, especially thinking about the fact that the rule is applicable at many levels, and it might apply a little differently at the levels the way it's written. We're pushing for something a little more comprehensive all the way from kindergarten through college. Yeah, and I guess the other thing I would say is a lot of the time I think because people aren't sure if intersex is like a third gender or a third sex, I just like to make clear that there are a lot of girls and women in the US who identify as girls and women. They have variations in their sex characteristics, and very often in athletics. It's those girls who, if they have features that people are like, that's kind of masculine, will get tagged and told that they're not going to be eligible to play or not going to be eligible to compete. And so I really love that this rule, written into a law that was meant to protect all students and, to protect women and girls broadly, needs to be understood to protect intersex women and girls as well.
Thanks, Erica. Melanie, would love to hear from you and Glisten's perspective. How would a rule like this impact trans and intersex youth? Why is it so important that trans and intersex youth have access to sports?
Yeah, and Erica, said it perfectly, right? It's like I too was a sports kid, and I wasn't very good, but I was enthusiastic and I was on the team, right? And so, what we know about sport, why sports are good for young people, all young, like any young person, is true when you apply it to LGBTQ plus students, and when you specifically talk about trans, non-binary, and intersex students, it's like it's same, right? Because at the end of the day, LGBTQ plus folks, trans, non-binary, intersex folks are people, right? Just like other people. And so we get the same benefits from doing the activities that other kids and other people get benefits from. So said in different smart ways, right? When LGBTQ plus students play sports, they are accepted as classmates, teammates, competitors. They gain access to the same physical, social, emotional benefits extended to all who participate in sports. And those who support these discriminatory measures know it, right? Literally is the point, right? What you're trying to do is erase, demean, exclude trans kids or other folks in the LGBTQ plus community, right? Then what you do is you don't let them be known, you don't let them be seen, you don't let them participate and be included. So when trans athletes are seen, they are accepted, and that's what this and all of these bills and all other discriminatory measures are seeking to deny. Right, denying trans, non-binary, intersex folks, but especially trans girls, is an opportunity, whether through legislation or rogue members of a judicial system. This is cruel and does nothing to address the actual existing gender discrimination and disparities in school sports, right? Like second-class funding or second-class equipment for girls' teams compared to boys' teams. Across the board, education, experts, and associations strongly support the full inclusion of transgender students, intersex students, non-binary students in physical education and athletics. We have to make sure that all of us, no matter who we are in the queer community or outside of it, are rising up to protect trans, intersex, non-binary student athletes from being ostracized.
Yes.
Let's all agree that we have to allow all youth to participate in all aspects of school life. And I would even go a little bit further and say that we not only have to let kids play, we have to let kids win sometimes, right? So it's not just good enough that you can like play and fine, we'll let you and your intersex, trans, or non-binary body participate. But if you win, we'll start asking questions. It's like,
Right.
no, let's all get to play and we sometimes get to win, just like everybody else.
Yeah. Thank you, Melanie. It really is that simple, right? It's like all youth should be able to play sports. It's really that simple. Thank you, Melanie. Folks, thank you so much for the questions. We're seeing questions come in through the chat. We will do our best to answer them. If we do not have time today to answer your questions, you can reach out to us at ncte@transequality.org. Our next question is for Melanie, Erica, and Olivia. There's confusion about the proposed rule and how it should be interpreted, right? Oftentimes when it comes to policy-related documents, it can often be confusing the way it's written. And so my question for everyone is, for each of your organizations, what are your thoughts about, like the confusion that's happening around the proposed rule, and where do you think the rule should be improved? There are some questions in the chat. I see Deborah's question here. Does this rule apply then to treatment of trans and intersex youth in schools beyond sports, such as using bathrooms during the school day? So would love to hear y'all's thoughts on where do you think the rule should be improved, and what do y'all think about just like some of the confusion about the proposed rule? And Melanie, I will let you start this question.
Yeah, sure thing. So listen, we see that the proposed rule is trying to grapple with the reality of bad actors, including transphobes and lawmakers looking to score political points by attacking trans children, right? We know that some of those transphobes are still going to try to and succeed at imposing restrictions, testing the department's ability and to robustly enforce the rule as proposed, right? This is really, we know that our opposition is clear, and they are advancing and they are emboldened. So they're going to keep trying what they've seen as a winning strategy. And we need the department to make sure that they've done their gut check to say, hey, if this is the rule and we want it to be stronger, and I'll talk about that in a minute, but if this is the rule, we're going to enforce it. And you're going to actually have to do the thing if you don't want to be found in violation. And so by including the strong language, which we like in the preamble, right, that prohibits the categorical bans and overbroad generalizations, great. We need to see that same strong language in the regulatory text itself, right? As said slightly differently, keep that same energy throughout the entire rule. We also have to name that what the preamble, some language in the preamble is problematic, right? It discusses injury prevention and fairness in competition. We should see that language as what it is, which is the opposition's language, transphobic language, and based on junk science and transphobic myths. And so the department needs to be clear that they intend to closely scrutinize efforts to use such overbroad generalizations and sex-based stereotypes to justify restrictions on students' equal participation consistent with their gender identity. So let me just say a couple more things. We believe the department should rule out justifications on these grounds altogether, and that there should be no restrictions on participation consistent with gender identity, and that participation should be permissible. At a bare minimum, the department should do the following. They should expressly affirm a presumption of participation consistent with gender identity. They should make clear that this presumption cannot be overcome in K-12 and college intramural and club sports contexts. They should provide examples of the types of evidence that would be deemed unacceptable in justifying restrictions in elite and collegiate athletics. intercollegiate athletics, and they should provide additional examples of the types of restrictions beyond categorical bans that would never be acceptable. So, for example, where youth are unable to access gender affirming medication, right, a restriction requiring such medication is a de facto categorical ban. And so part of what's happening, and this was said at the top, is that we're dealing with a patchwork. We're dealing with a patchwork, right? That like in 14 states, in DC, queer, trans, non-binary, and intersex kids can participate in sports without any restrictions. In 21 states, there's a ban, and even more states with over 400 terrible pieces of legislation being proposed and passed this legislative cycle alone. There's all kinds of attacks coming from all over the place, right? What we don't want in this country is for a kid, any kid in one school in one state to be guaranteed and have access to all parts of school life and to get a wonderful education and have access to everything they need. And a kid just a few feet away across some imaginary line, right, drawn on a map, not have access to or access to that same quality education or have discrimination against them allowed. Right, we know this in our bodies, right? We know this in our history, right? There were slave states and free states, right? We know this from the marriage fight. There were states where you could get married as a queer person, and states you couldn't get married as a queer person. We know that the patchwork approach does not work to ensure freedom, right? To ensure protection in this country, and so we have to make sure that every kid and every school. Again, we require kids to be in school, particularly for us at GLSEN. If you're in K-12 school, you're there because you have to be, right? We have like actual laws about that. And so no kid should be excluded from participating in all parts of that school life, whether it's bathrooms or sports teams, whether it's seeing themselves, their communities, where they come from, and the curriculum that they're learning, right? No one should be excluded from participating fully in the education system, and that education system should be grounded in truth, affirming, inclusive, et cetera. So long and rambly, but just to say that, like, again, this covers a lot of ground. There's more things that it needs to include. We at GLSEN are writing a super long, really comprehensive comment on this, telling the department exactly what they should do, because we've got good ideas. We would encourage other folks to also pitch in, right, to put your comment in at the letusplay.teams portal, because it's important that we hear that the department hears from everyone. So how it's enforced, who gets what, it's important for our government to hear from us.
Thank you, Melanie. And before I pass off to Erica, for folks who are tuning in and want to maybe take a deeper look at the draft proposed rule, there is a fact sheet at the letusplay.team website. So feel free to pull that up, take a look at it, and that also includes more details on what the draft rule is proposing. Erica, again, the question was, there's confusion about the proposed rule and how it should be interpreted. What are your thoughts about that? And where do you think, from your perspective, from Interact's perspective, should the rule be improved?
Thanks for the question. I think we at Interact are vibing in a lot of the same places that Melanie describes GLSEN vibing, and I think I kind of want to talk about it in practical terms, because I will say the first time I read the rule, I was like, what is this? Like, why does it seem like it's just like letting the schools write their own bans? And that so many of us had that reaction the first time we read it. And then, I kind of sat back and I was like, okay, like, much as I would love to believe that these rules are written like for the consumption of the people that they're written to protect, they're written for lawyers. And so I was like, okay, I got to go find my lawyer costume and put on my legal glasses and read it like that. And, to be honest, when I read it like that, like the second time I was like, okay, like this is actually a pretty high bar. And the third time I was really thinking about it like a lawyer, and I was like, so many schools are just like, those schools and those school districts have lawyers. That is who has to read this rule. And if they want to try to do something shady and figure out a way to keep trans and intersex kids off of women's and girls' teams, they're gonna have to do some real head scratching. This rule, as it's written, it sets the bar really high. And folks have offered like valid critiques where they're like, oh well, when they say, you know, any restriction would have to be justified by like fairness in sports or fairness in competition and like things like that. Like, aren't they kind of just pointing the bad actors in the direction that they need to write their trans and intersex sports bans? And I feel like you could say yes. And I also think, when I'm sitting there in my lawyer costume thinking about it all, I feel like the amount of like intense lawyering and the fear of liability, like schools and school districts don't want to get sued. So, I feel pretty sure that even if the rule goes forward just as it is, that there are it'll have a lot of impact, but what I do think is, just like what Melanie has said, you know, there are a lot of different people who read this rule, and it's not just the lawyers, and it's not just the impacted community, and in this case, we're talking about kids. Kids are not reading this rule necessarily. If I was like a serious college athlete, you better believe I would be like, paying a lot of attention to this. I hope that if there are folks who are in school sports who are listening, or your kids are, please do click on the link and comment. Yeah, and I think the main thing I want to get across is just like, practically speaking, there are a lot of different ways that this rule could theoretically be improved. There are plenty of people who think that this rule is really solid and really protective as it is. And there are many of us who are going to make some recommendations. There's a lot of stuff in the guidance surrounding the rule, not in the actual text of the rule, that I'm just like, wouldn't it be great if that really clear statement that the government has made that X, Y, or Z thing is not going to be kosher? Wouldn't it be great if that was just in the rule itself? Not always when the government is writing rules does it want to use more words rather than less. So you'll often see a short rule and a ton of guidance, and that's what's happened here. More than anything, like, the important thing is that people who believe in the importance of trans rights and intersex rights, that you all comment. You could take the rule to task and say 80 things that you hate about the rule. You could just write and say, love what you're trying to do here, keep it up. But the most important thing is that folks who are, in support of trans and intersex rights comment, and that you say, whatever happens with this rule, I want it to protect trans and intersex kids in sports. I want it to protect people at the college level in sports. Anything that the rule, any way that the rule can be changed to make that outcome even more likely is good. And like, I just urge that because we know that so many people who are coming with really regressive, backwards ideals about sex and gender and what like the lives of trans kids are like if they even believe that such a thing exists. And I'm just like, anyway, yeah, those folks are going to comment, and they're going to take the rule apart because their headlines are just like, Biden administration lets trans kids do whatever the hell they want in schools and whatever. Fine. Even if you don't like the rule the way it is, that's cool. But just make sure that when you are commenting, you are letting, your government know where you stand and that you want the most protective rule that trans kids and intersex kids can get.
Awesome. Thank you, Erica. Olivia, anything you'd like to add? What are your thoughts on the rule? Where do you think the rule could be improved?
Sure. So first off, I just need to thank you both, Melanie and Erica, for just laying everything out really clearly. NCTE is in alignment with both Interact and GLSEN on a lot of the changes that need to happen with this rule for all the same reasons. One perspective that I come to when I'm talking about this rule, or this proposed rule, I should say, is in a previous part of my career, I actually was the lawyer for a city council in a school district. And having been that lawyer, one thing I can say that's necessary, and it's part of why we're asking for clarification in this, is that, yeah, this is concept. This is a concept that's very lawyerly and definitely is going to be needs lawyers to untangle. But I've been that lawyer, and you also need to explain it to the council. You need to explain it to the school board. You need to make them understand what's up. And so I've been thinking about how I would explain that to the clients that I had, years and years ago. And the metaphor that I've come up with is this rule creates a giant wall that says you cannot go past here with discrimination against trans youth, except through this tiny little tunnel, which is sort of like a pressure release valve. Now, there's a tunnel. It's right over there somewhere. We're not going to tell you exactly where it is. We're not going to tell you what shape it is. We're not going to tell you how long it is. We're not going to tell you if it has any twists and turns. It has to be there in order to protect the structural integrity of this rule. By the way, all of the vehicles that you have tried to drive through this wall before will not fit through that tunnel, and we're not going to tell you what will. The only safe way that you can make sure that you are not going to just wind up crashing your car inside this tunnel is to not even try, to abide by the rule as written, as intended, and to allow full inclusion for trans, non-binary, and intersex youth within school sports. Now, I realize, I own the fact that is an incredibly strained metaphor, but it is the best way that I think I can explain to folks how this works and why what it originally appears to be, like Erica said, is an enormous license to discriminate really isn't, and instead is actually creating a very, very narrow path that makes this more protective than it would otherwise be if you just asked a judge to interpret a very broad rule that didn't actually include any of the explanatory language. So, in addition to everything that, that Melanie and Erica said, I think that one of the things that would be helpful in a final rule is clarity. That includes, in a lot of places, moving those elements like clarification that a categorical ban is impermissible into the actual text of the rule instead of leaving it in the preamble. Perhaps, inclusions of saying explicitly that medical inspections are not permissible, that visual inspections are not permissible of people's bodies, or that requiring intrusive medical procedures to allow somebody to participate in sports according to their gender impermissible. Providing additional clarification is really going to help not just explain the rule to people whose rights are impacted by it, but also to the people who have to enforce it and have to write these policies. Because if they don't truly understand what their responsibilities are under this rule, they're going to wind up crashing in that tunnel right away. Now, when it comes to commenting on it, I know I saw a question come through a little bit ago about, do we have any advice on how to write a comment? And if you go to letusplay.team, connected from the comment portal page, you'll find a list of information and suggested talking points on how to structure a comment, how to provide information and feedback to the federal government, and make it clear that you want trans kids to be fully included, to be able to participate, that you think trans athletes have a place in their schools and in their communities from kindergarten through to college. And one thing to clarify again also is this is about sports. There was an entirely different rulemaking comment process a year ago, almost, that was about all the other parts of non-discrimination in school. This is specifically about sports. When you're commenting, think about that, keep it limited to that, and tell the administration that you want trans kids to be able to play with their friends.
Awesome. Thank you, Olivia. So we have about 10-15 minutes left. So we have one more question, and we'll talk briefly about the comment portal that we've already touched on, and then hopefully take a question or two from folks. And this last question is for Olivia. For folks who may have missed this earlier and might be tuning in just now, how does this Title IX rule impact state bills and legislation? Melanie gave an incredible overview of what we're seeing across the nation and how many bills are being introduced, all that. Does Title IX supersede state bills?
So I would love to spend a lengthy, nuanced conversation on the nature of law and explain all the nuances and ins and outs of that question. But the short version is yes, Title IX supersedes conflicting state laws. This is the kind of federal law that overrides state laws that are in conflict with it. Now, if you really get into the nuts and bolts of that, there's a lot more complicated stuff about enforcement mechanisms and who's impacted and who has what we call standing to it. But the short version is Title IX supersedes conflicting state law.
Awesome. Thanks, Olivia. All right, y'all. So we've talked a little bit about the rule, why it's important, and now we'll talk about what we can do. Between now and May 15th, so that's 11 days, you can submit a public comment advocating for an athletics Title IX rule that protects and includes all youth to play sports with their friends. We talked a little bit about our shared goal between our organizations, and which is trying to finalize a rule that is as strong and as inclusive as possible. It takes at minimum 5 minutes for you to submit a comment, and you can submit a comment at letusplay.team, as some folks have mentioned. And the goal is to send a strong message to the Department of Education. In order to send that strong message, we need as many people as possible to submit a public comment. So tell your friends, tell your family, your coworkers, everyone you know, and encourage them to take at minimum 5 minutes to submit a comment between now and May 15th. And whether you are a trans youth, an educator, a peer, a supportive adult, anyone can submit a public comment. So again, anyone can submit a public comment. You do not need to be trans. You don't need to be intersex to submit a public comment. As long as you support trans and intersex youth, you are more than welcome to submit a public comment. When you go to the letusplay.team website, as Olivia mentioned, there are some talking points there, some information that you can utilize to submit a comment. There's also a comment form specifically for youth, and then a comment form specifically for adults. And so whether you're a young person or an adult, fill out the appropriate form. That being said, there's some language on the website that you can use to draft your comment, but I'd love to ask Olivia, Melanie, and Erica, what sorts of things do you think people should include or communicate in their comment? And I know a couple of us have touched a little bit on that, but Olivia, yeah, what sorts of things would you say folks should include in their comment?
So one of the most impactful things, one of the most helpful things when we're looking at this kind of comment is being able to put a human face on what's happening for the administration, for the Department of Education. So when you're thinking about what you want to write in your comment, especially if you're a student athlete, think about how it's impacting you personally. If you're a supportive student, if you're currently enrolled in high school or college, think about how it impacts you and how it's not the kind of world you want to live in when your classmates are being excluded from having the rights that you have. Talk about how you as a trans athlete are directly impacted by these rules and what it means to you to be excluded. If you are a supportive adult, then talk through the importance of seeing trans people properly represented and having a place within our communities. Talk about how important it is to see your child being able to play with their trans friends when they're out and playing sports in school. A lot of people might think that they can't write a comment because they don't have a deep analytical knowledge of the nature of federal civil rights law, or because they don't know all the statistics. I'll be blunt. That's us. That's our job as organizations that specialize in this. We'll handle the statistics. We'll handle the deeper level, legal arguments. Focus on your story, how it impacts you, how it impacts your community, how it impacts your family when you're writing your comment.
Awesome. Thank you, Olivia. And then Melanie, I will pass it off to you. Same question. What sorts of things do you feel people should make sure to include or communicate in their comment to the Department of Education?
Yeah, totally. So first and foremost, it's important that those using the portal share their story or perspective, right? It's your unique answer to the question on why it matters that trans, non-binary, intersex students are able to play school sports alongside their peers. Um, I say this because both your story and your perspective is what the Department of Education needs to hear. And that personalizing is what makes the difference between whether your comment is counted as unique or is counted as a duplicate of a template letter, right? It's so important that trans, non-binary, and intersex youth voices are heard here. Y'all are the ones. It is you, right? That is like there are advocates like me and the other folks on this call. There are organizations advocating all the time, but it's your experience that counts the most here, right? So if you experience discrimination or exclusion in school sports and you're willing to share your story, the government needs to hear that story. If you've avoided school sports because you feared being excluded, the government needs to hear that story. If a welcoming school sport experience has made the difference in your life, the government needs to hear that story. That story. It's incredibly important and lifts up what's possible. Because so much of this is based on fear and ignorance, and this like we don't know any trans, non-binary, or intersex people, so who knows what it's going to be like when they're in sports? It's like that's bull, and we all know it. And it helps when you give the government, the folks, the real people behind on the other side of the screen who are reading this and making the effort to make the changes that we've been advocating for. It's important they hear your story. So a couple other things. So for parents and families of trans, intersex, and non-binary kids, speak to the same kind of thing. Like when you've seen this make a difference, both the exclusion part, the bad difference, but also a good difference when you've seen inclusion. All students might speak to their experiences with school sports, playing along trans and their non-binary and gender non-conforming peers, and how trans exclusion restrictions encourage gender policing and reinforce stereotypes. A way that gender stereotypes, particularly anti-trans and transphobic gender stereotypes, impacts folks along racial lines, right? Is that folks who are farther and farther away from being white or closer and closer to being seen and identifying as being Black, right, are often seen as less feminine, right, are often seen as more masculine, right? There's a way in which that these gender stereotypes, this gender discrimination impacts so many folks who might identify as trans or intersex or non-binary or not. And then educators finally could speak to the educational benefits that they've observed, as well as the harms they've observed when schools have exclusionary policies for trans, non-binary, and intersex folks.
Thank you, Melanie. Erica, what are your thoughts on things, language that folks should include when they're writing their comment?
Ditto to all. And I think, a lot of the time, folks who are not impacted or not like family members of an impacted person might hold off on commenting. So like, oh, like this isn't really about me, or like my voice isn't important here. And I think in a particular way, like the voices of allies and people who support the rights of young people to, just play sports are even that much more important in a way. And certainly there's strength in the numbers. And same for you. Like your perspective is useful, and if that just means like talking about a time that you felt excluded, or talking about a time when you felt singled out, or talking about a time when you've seen that happen to someone else, like the people reading this, whether or not they have on their lawyer costumes, they're still human beings. I think what became very clear to me very fast when I read this rule is that it represents, whatever you think of it in the details, it represents people in the administration working hard to protect kids and to do the right thing. And so, I think that as long as we are speaking with our authentic voices, we'll make an impact. And I really believe that.
Fantastic. All right, we have time for 1 or 2 questions. I see that we've gotten quite a number of questions, which is great. Unfortunately, we won't be able to get to all of them. And so as a reminder, if we do not have time to get to your question, please, 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 please send your question to us at ncte@transequality.org. We will do our very best to answer those questions in a timely manner. And if it is for specific panelists, let us know in the email, and we'll make sure to forward it to Erica and or Melanie. The first question that I have here, and thank you, Tekla, who is working behind the scenes, supporting all the tech things. I am not good at that, so Tekla, thank you. Question for Melanie. Would this Title IX rule have an impact on bathroom/locker room access?
Yeah, so that's a great question, right? So what I understand, and I'll leave it like I know that there are other people who know more about Title IX than I do. Also, I'm the only one here without a lawyer costume. I don't know who to talk to, but I need to talk to somebody's manager about that. So does it apply to, like, was it you said locker rooms and
bathroom access
and bathroom access? Yeah. So this is specific. This Title IX rule is about gender discrimination, prohibiting gender discrimination in educational contexts and settings, right? So school and school places. And that is not just about sports, right? But like I said at the top, we often think about Title IX as being around prohibiting sexual harassment and sexual assault, supporting pregnant and parenting folks in school settings, and also access and funding for sports, right? So what we're double clicking on is the sports impact here, but and what this rule is double clicking on is really trans participation in sports. But also Title IX is really about the prohibition of discrimination based on gender identity, right? Sexual and sex and gender, right? That's what we know from Boston. So that's kind of clumsy. My apologies, but yes, I think is my sense. But I'm not a lawyer, and I don't have a lawyer costume. Again, I don't know when you talk to about that.
Yeah, Olivia or Eric, is there anything that you'd like to add before I present the second question?
Sure. So ever since Title IX first came out in the early 70s, I think 1972, if I'm remembering correctly, we just passed its 50th anniversary. It's been written into the statute and into the regulations that sex segregated sports get a completely separate set of rules from all other things related to sex discrimination in education. So when we're talking about bathroom access, when we're talking to facilities access, which can include locker rooms, that's kind of all covered by the other rulemaking that we saw last year. This rulemaking is specifically about the athletics portion of it, which is the participation in sex segregated sports or sex separated sports, I think is the official term in there. I will confess up front, I am not a Title IX expert. I am originally a name change nerd who has been diversifying here at NCTE. Now, when we're looking at this, we're expecting to see a fairly inclusive, hopefully very inclusive, general Title IX rule, which will cover a lot of those accesses, like access to facilities, access to things like extracurricular clubs that are not sports. This rulemaking that we're talking about right now is only within the realm of participation in sex-separated athletics activities.
Thank you, Olivia. The last question is for Erica. Jenny asked on Facebook, what about the visual checks that is happening in some states?
Yeah, great. Thank you for lifting that back up, Alex. And I'll say that stuff like that is stuff that kids with intersex traits experience in a lot of different contexts. I am delighted to say that the Department of Education has made really, really clear in its supporting text around the rule that any kind of physical examination like that would be invalid and, in this case, prohibited by law if its purpose or its outcome, and this is broad, is like could be used to deny young person's participation on a sports team that best aligns with their gender identity. So, considering that either the purpose or the outcome of such an examination would be to limit a kid's participation, basically, yes. You know, like, again, mean lawyers in bad lawyer costumes are probably already crawling around in their mean lawyer tunnels or wherever they are. I don't know, because I'm not one of those. Trying to figure out how they can justify a thing. And basically the answer is none of that. None of that under this rule.
Awesome. Thanks, Erica. All right, folks.
Sorry, can I just add one
yes.
thing, which is to say, I appreciate this. I appreciate the kind of talking about like, hey, read appropriately, right? This is a broad protection that does the right stuff. And there's like a little tiny carve out over here to release the pressure from the system and that kind of thing. And I think it's important for us to acknowledge that our opposition, right, folks who like the folks on the other side of this argument have nothing but time and money to throw at this, right? And so part of what we have to make sure, part of what GLSEN is fighting for, is to make sure that this rule is as good and as tight and as clear as possible, because the other side literally has nothing else better to do than to try to control, right, the bodies and participation and civil rights of people who are not like them, right? And that's everybody on this LGBTQ plus team, especially the plus folks, because it falls so far out of their control, right? So I appreciate all this that we're saying, but I just want to lift up the fact that our opposition is well funded and activated. And so it's important that you put in a comment, but it's also important. That's why, right? Because they're going to flood the system, so we should flood it also on the good side, the side of support. But also we should be clear that the bad lawyers and the bad lawyer costumes, there's more of them than there are of us, right? Because they're all paid to be bad lawyers, and they're just us being regular good old folks who are out here trying to make the world better. And so we got to make this rule as good as possible, because that other side is super well funded and really activated at that.
Thank you, Melanie. 3 things before I hand it back to these amazing panelists to give any closing statements that they would like. 1, if we did not get to your question, I'm so sorry. Please, please, please write to us at ncte@transequality.org. We will do our best to get back to you. Second thing, go to letusplay.team if you have not already. Submit a public comment. I am begging you, and tell your friends, family, and everyone you know to also submit a public comment before May 15th. The third thing, follow, if you don't already, GLSEN, Interacting NCTE, and the work that we are all doing. We are doing so many incredible things outside of just the Title IX work. So I encourage you, if you do not already follow or support our work, please do so. That being said, Melanie, Erica, and Olivia, any closing statements before we let folks enjoy the rest of their evening? All right, y'all. Thank you so much. Again, May 15th is the deadline. Reach out to us anytime, and hope you all take care.
Thank you.